when you look into their eyes, you know somebody is home.
They're an animal that possesses great spiritual power, not to be meddled with.
The industry has a vested interest in spinning these. That sells a lot of Shamu dolls. It sells a lot of tickets at the gate.
There's no record of an orca doing any harm in the wild.
That documentary came out in 2013. Tim Zimmerman was the associate producer and co-writer of Blackfish. 6 years ago, he first wrote about the problem in Outside magazine after a trainer was killed by an orca at SeaWorld in Orlando, Florida. Tim Zimmerman joins me now from Washington. So Tim, what's your thought on the announcement to stop the breeding program 6 years after you first wrote about the problem in your article, The Killer in the Pool?
Well, I think it's an amazing and decisive change in direction for SeaWorld. It's always been the case that any of us following this issue have known that as soon as SeaWorld would finally announce an end to captive breeding, that would signal that there was going to be an end to killer whale entertainment. So I've been amazed, and I give credit to Joel Manby, the new CEO, for making this decision. I think it is a very hard decision for SeaWorld to have made. At the same time, I think it was an inevitable decision. The business model was failing. As they acknowledged, there are too many questions about killer whales in captivity, and it was costing them money and costing them business. So kudos to them for recognizing reality and making a change.
What was your reaction? Were you surprised? Were you shocked? What went through your mind when you heard about this today?
I was both surprised and not surprised. Not surprised because, as I said, I think that it was inevitable. The business model was failing, but I was surprised that it happened as quickly as it did since Joel Manby came in just under a year ago to try to turn SeaWorld around. I guess he's a good businessman. He looked at the internal numbers and knew he had to make a change and make it quickly, and so he did. But I think any of us involved in Blackfish were pretty surprised at how quickly he decided to make this change.
Let's talk about Blackfish because, you know, a lot of people saw this, a lot of celebrities saw this, Matt Damon, Ewan McGregor, Willie Nelson, and after seeing this, they really started to speak out about orcas living in captivity. So how much credit or how much influence do you think Blackfish had on this decision today?
I think Blackfish had a big influence. It's not an influence that any of us who were making it expected it to have. We were just trying to make a good film. But in retrospect, it touched millions of people, partly because it got to a wide audience through CNN and other online platforms, but also I think because it told a story that was just so shocking and at odds with the story that SeaWorld had been telling for 50 years, that it made people really sit up and start to pay attention to the lives of killer whales in parks like SeaWorld. And I think that once people were inspired or they realized what the reality was for killer whales at SeaWorld, they didn't just go on with their lives. The impressive thing to me is so many people then went online, used social media to pressure and campaign against SeaWorld and killer whale captivity. And so I give a lot of credit to the grassroots movement that grew up following Blackfish that I think is really responsible for this change.
So the 29 orcas that are still there are going to remain there. They will stop the breeding program. There won't be the tricks show, for lack of a better way of describing it. They'll instead have what they're calling natural encounters. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. I'm sure that SeaWorld and Joel Manby, the CEO, are hoping that this announcement and this shift in the tone and the content of the orca presentations or shows will satisfy critics and will allow SeaWorld to go back to doing what it's trying to do. But the reality is that there will be killer whales at SeaWorld for probably 30 years or more from now. And the problem with captivity has always been captivity itself. And changing the shows and what you're talking about while killer whales are in small pools won't necessarily make people feel comfortable about the presence of the killer whales. So I do think that one thing that SeaWorld may have to confront and think about quite soon is whether it's feasible to retire those killer whales to sea-based sanctuaries, more natural environments that are more stimulating and perhaps better environments for those killer whales to spend the remaining decades in.
I was just reading that, just to talk a little bit about Blackfish, and the main character in Blackfish, the killer whale featured, is actually quite sick. And how do you feel about that, or what did you think about that when you heard that?
Well, I mean, I think that anyone who has grown attached to this issue, who thinks deeply about this issue, has always been grateful to Tilikum, the killer whale that you're mentioning, who's ill now. He's the one that forced the world to pay attention to conditions for killer whales in captivity, and he's really he's really what got my reporting started, what got Blackfish started, what got so much of this started. And the fact that he's sick now is terribly sad. People, despite the violence in his life, he was responsible or involved in the deaths of 3 humans. When they learned about his life, became very sympathetic towards him. I think it's fitting, though, that in a way he's still alive and hopefully he'll live for a while longer. It's fitting, though, that he's outlived the Shamu show, because he really is the reason that everyone started paying attention in the first place.
And by the way, just as you were talking, we were showing some images of that killer whale that you were just talking about. Can you just sum up for people who may not necessarily be aware, in terms of killer whales in captivity versus killer whales in the wild? In the wild, they're not known to be violent or to want to hurt people, right? But in captivity, obviously, they can.
Well, I mean, the way I like to explain it is, if you just imagine how unnatural captivity would seem or be for a killer whale that's come from the wild. I mean, in the oceans, the killer whales can swim up to 100 miles a day. They spend their lives in family groupings. They're highly intelligent, arguably the second most intelligent species on the planet. And they're very social. And to go from that sort of environment where the ocean is your playground to a concrete pool, no matter what size that pool is, where you hear mechanical sounds, you're mixed in with killer whales from all different groups and parts of the world, you can only imagine how dislocating and stressful that would be. And so I think that when people see Tilikum particularly, who's the largest killer whale at SeaWorld, and see how isolated he is and know how long he's been in captivity, more than 33 years, they naturally just, raises questions for them about, is this a good idea? And is it wise to keep these animals in captivity like that? And so all those questions have changed SeaWorld's business, and now SeaWorld is changing, as they say, with the world.
So orcas are actually part of the dolphin family species, and there are other marine mammals under SeaWorld's case. So what are you hoping will happen next for them?
Well, that's I think, in many ways, the most interesting question to come out of this. SeaWorld has started down what I would say is a pretty slippery slope. Dolphins, killer whales are the largest species of dolphin, and if SeaWorld is saying that it doesn't make sense to breed and keep killer whales in entertaining shows, I think it's an obvious question to say, well, why does it make sense to do that with your dolphins as well? And so I think SeaWorld will inevitably have to address questions about the welfare and well-being of many of its marine mammals, none of whom are doing particularly well in captivity. Beluga whales, which SeaWorld has and which exist in Canada as well, don't do well in captivity. Sea lions, walruses, all these animals are not necessarily suited to be in these captive environments in entertainment shows and for businesses to make profits off of. And I think that SeaWorld may have a hard time drawing a line at killer whales. We'll see how it plays out, but I do think that, it does raise questions for all marine mammals in captivity.